When people think about Swiss banks, they imagine mountains of gold bars, numbered accounts, and billionaires hiding their fortunes from prying eyes. Hollywood has painted this picture for decades: secret vaults beneath the Alps, mysterious bankers with perfect accents and impeccable suits. But the real story of Swiss banking isn't about conspiracy theories or movie plots. It's about a financial system that became the world's safe haven through centuries of calculated moves, political neutrality, and an obsession with discretion that transformed a small landlocked country into the planet's financial fortress. The secrets locked in those vaults aren't just about money. They're about power, survival, and the art of staying rich when everything else collapses. And if you think Swiss banking is just for the ultra-wealthy, you're missing the deeper lesson, because the principles that built Switzerland's financial empire can teach anyone how to protect wealth when the world goes insane. Let me tell you what really happened in those mountains and why it still matters today. Switzerland didn't become the world's banker by accident. It started with geography and evolved through genius. Nestled between France, Germany, Italy, and Austria, Switzerland sat at the crossroads of European power for centuries. While empires rose and fell around them, the Swiss made a choice that would define their future. They chose neutrality. Not because they were weak, but because they understood something their neighbors didn't. Wars destroy wealth. Neutrality preserves it. The foundation of Swiss banking secrecy goes back to 1713, when the government of Geneva first prohibited bankers from revealing client information. But the real catalyst came much later, during the chaos of the 1930s. As Hitler rose to power in Germany, wealthy Germans and Jews began moving their assets across the border. They needed somewhere safe, somewhere the Nazis couldn't reach. Switzerland became that sanctuary. In 1934, the Swiss passed the Federal Act on banks and savings banks, making banking secrecy a criminal offense to violate. Breaking client confidentiality could land you in prison. This wasn't just about privacy, it was about survival. What the Swiss understood was simple but profound. Money flows to safety. When governments collapse, currencies fail, or wars break out, wealth seeks the most secure harbour it can find. By positioning themselves as that harbour, Switzerland didn't just protect foreign money, they captured it, and once that money arrived, it never wanted to leave. But secrecy was only part of the equation. The Swiss built something far more valuable than hidden accounts. They built trust. Swiss banks didn't just promise to keep your secrets, they proved it again and again through decades of political upheaval, economic crisis, and international pressure. When World War II tore Europe apart, Swiss vaults remained untouched. When currencies collapsed across the continent, the Swiss franc held steady. When governments seized private property, Swiss accounts stayed private. This wasn't luck, it was system design. The Swiss understood that banking isn't really about money, it's about confidence. And confidence requires more than promises. It requires proof that the system works even when everything else fails. The mechanics of Swiss banking secrecy were elegant in their simplicity. Numbered accounts replaced names. Bankers communicated through codes. Face-to-face meetings happened in unmarked offices. Deposits could be made through intermediaries who never revealed the true owner. The system was designed like layers of an onion. Each layer provided another barrier between the money and anyone trying to trace it. But here's what most people miss. The real power of Swiss banking wasn't the secrecy itself. It was the stability that secrecy enabled. When wealthy individuals and families knew their assets were protected from political seizure, currency devaluation, or economic collapse, they were willing to park enormous sums in Swiss institutions for decades. This created a massive pool of stable capital that Swiss banks could invest conservatively and profitably. The secrecy attracted the money. The stability multiplied it. By the 1960s, Switzerland held an estimated 1/3 of all private wealth managed outside investors' home countries. Think about that for a moment. A country with fewer people than New York City controlled 1/3 of the world's offshore money. That wasn't just financial success. It was financial dominance on a scale rarely seen in history. The Swiss didn't just manage this money passively, they put it to work. Swiss banks became the backbone of international finance, funding everything from government bonds to corporate expansion to real estate development across the globe. The wealth hidden in their vaults wasn't sitting idle. It was generating returns, creating jobs, and building infrastructure worldwide. The secrecy that attracted the money enabled investments that shaped the modern economy. and the profits were staggering. Swiss banks charged premium fees for their discretion and security. Wealthy clients paid gladly, knowing their assets were protected from taxation, confiscation, and devaluation. The banks used these fees and the massive deposits to build an empire of financial services. Private banking, wealth management, investment advisory, currency trading, precious metals storage. Switzerland became a one-stop shop for protecting and growing wealth. But the system faced its first major test during the 1970s, when global currencies began floating freely after the collapse of the Bretton Woods system. Suddenly, exchange rates were volatile, inflation was rising, and traditional investments were losing value. Wealthy investors needed new strategies to preserve their fortunes. Swiss banks were ready. They pioneered currency hedging, precious metals investing, and alternative asset management. When the world's financial system shifted, Switzerland adapted and thrived. The genius of the Swiss approach was that it created a self-reinforcing cycle. The more money that flowed into Swiss banks, the more stable and powerful those banks became. The more stable they became, the more money flowed in. Success bred success, and Switzerland's position as the world's financial safe haven grew stronger with each passing decade. The secrets hidden in those vaults weren't just account numbers and gold bars. They were the financial strategies of the world's most successful families and institutions. These weren't random investments or get-rich-quick schemes. They were methodical approaches to wealth preservation that had been tested across generations. The Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, European nobility, industrial titans, and oil barons all followed similar playbooks. Diversification across currencies, countries, and asset classes. Never putting all their eggs in one political basket. Always maintaining liquidity for opportunities or emergencies. And most importantly, thinking in decades, not years. Swiss bankers became students of this generational wealth management. They watched how old money families weathered economic storms, political upheavals, and social revolutions. The patterns were clear. Families that lasted centuries didn't just accumulate wealth, they protected it through systematic approaches that most people never see. They owned assets in multiple jurisdictions. They held precious metals as insurance. They invested in businesses that produced essential goods and services. They maintained relationships with discrete financial institutions that could operate in any environment. The Swiss took these lessons and turned them into services. They didn't just offer bank accounts, they offered complete wealth ecosystems. A wealthy client could store gold in Zurich vaults, hold currencies in numbered accounts, own real estate through shell companies, and invest in businesses through carefully structured trusts. All of it managed with Swiss precision and protected by Swiss secrecy laws. It was like having a financial bunker that could withstand any crisis. But the real secret weapon was timing. Swiss banks understood that wealth preservation isn't just about what you own, it's about when you move. They developed networks of information that allowed them to anticipate political changes, currency devaluations, and economic shifts before they happened. When revolution threatened a country, Swiss bankers already knew. When a currency was about to collapse, they were prepared. When governments planned to seize private assets, the money was already gone. This intelligence network wasn't built through spies or insider trading. It was built through relationships. Swiss bankers cultivated connections with politicians, diplomats, business leaders, and other bankers across the globe. They attended the same social events, joined the same clubs, and developed the same contacts as their wealthy clients. Information flowed naturally through these channels. Giving Swiss institutions of power was extraordinary, in advance warning of threats and opportunities. To predict the months before major devaluations, Swiss banks would quietly help clients move assets to stronger currencies. Before political coups, money would disappear from local banks and reappear in Swiss accounts. Before economic collapses, investments would be restructured to profit from the chaos rather than suffer from it. The Swiss weren't causing these events. They were simply positioning their clients to survive and thrive regardless of what happened. This ability to see around corners became Switzerland's greatest competitive advantage. Other countries had banks. Other countries had secrecy laws, but no other country had developed the combination of neutrality, stability, and financial intelligence that made Swiss banks indispensable to the global elite. They weren't just protecting money, they were providing a crystal ball that showed wealthy families how to stay wealthy no matter what the future held. The 1980s brought new challenges and opportunities. The Cold War created massive capital flows as money fled communist countries. The rise of international terrorism made physical security more important than ever. The growth of global markets created new investment opportunities, but also new risks. Swiss banks adapted to each change, expanding their services and strengthening their position as the world's financial fortress. They pioneered private banking services that went far beyond simple account management. Swiss banks offered family office services, helping wealthy dynasties manage everything from investments to philanthropy to succession planning. They provided concierge services that could handle anything from buying rare art to arranging private security. They created trust structures so complex that even governments struggled to understand them, let alone penetrate them. The sophistication was breathtaking. A single wealthy family might have dozens of accounts, companies, and trusts spread across multiple Swiss institutions. Money would flow between them in patterns that looked random, but were actually carefully orchestrated to minimize taxes, avoid regulations, and maintain maximum flexibility. The Swiss didn't just hide the money, they made it invisible while keeping it completely accessible to the rightful owners. But perhaps the most important service Swiss banks provided was something money can't buy elsewhere: institutional memory. These weren't new businesses run by ambitious entrepreneurs. They were century-old institutions managed by families who had been in banking for generations. They had seen every type of crisis, every kind of client, and every possible threat to wealth. Their knowledge wasn't theoretical. It was practical wisdom earned through decades of protecting fortunes, through world wars, revolutions, depressions, and disasters. So what does all this mean for you today? The secrets hidden in Swiss bank vaults aren't just about numbered accounts or gold bars. They're about understanding how real wealth survives when everything else collapses. The Swiss didn't build their empire through luck or conspiracy. They built it through principles anyone can learn: neutrality in chaos, trust through consistency, and the wisdom to think in decades, not quarters. The ultra-wealthy didn't just hide their money in Switzerland. They learned how to think like the Swiss. They diversified across borders, currencies, and generations. They built systems that could weather any storm. They understood that true wealth isn't about having money. It's about keeping it when the world goes insane. The same forces that drove money into Swiss vaults centuries ago are still at work today. Governments still collapse, currencies still fail, wars still destroy wealth, and money still flows to safety. The question isn't whether these things will happen again. The question is whether you'll be prepared when they do. History doesn't repeat, but if you ignore what it teaches, it will crush you all the same. The Swiss learned that lesson long ago, and their vaults are still full because of it. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers.